Africa continent victim of a fierce colonization. There was not a local power that opposed the invasions of the Portuguese, British, French, Belgians, Germans, and only Dutch and Spanish. It was imposed the conditions of exporters and consumers of all the products created from Europe, qualified as potencies and hegemonic means as a subdeveloped area, very corrupt and politically unstable, completely in disorder. How would this geography would be if the rich from the north would not have come to rape and plunder? What story would we be telling about Mother Africa if the relation would have been among equals? Massacres, wars, exterminations, coup, and interference are not things of the past. Many documents are revealed. There are many military bases appearing and across this continent. For the projects in the United States, AFRICOM, and the organization had 36 positions in 24 countries of the continent. What is the result of this with Congo, with Yemen and Sudan and France? They still say what they began in Algeria, Morocco and Tunisia. What part the UN have? What is the role the UN plays? Africa, it's a plunder, cyclical plunder. This is what we're going to talk today, and we will begin. And through many years of sanitization and mission and impoverishment of an entire continent, today with transnationals and yesterday with invasions. So is it political? Is it cultural? Is it social? At a meeting in the White House where a migration project was given to on debate, Donald Trump referred to several countries, among them the African ones, as like holes for excrement. This uncovers his xenophobic thought. The United Nations Commission had to describe that comment as racist. However, not population, but the White House had to say, but doesn't mean that somebody that's not white is also welcomed. Honestly, I am very impacted. Have you ever come to this country so you can call this a shit country? This is of course perfectly racist. There's nothing left to say. It's extremely offensive, racist, and dangerous. There's Botswana and South Africa who are reacting through their vice president in the African Congress after the comment. There are millions of unemployed in the United States, millions without a health coverage. And we would never make such a pejorative comment that with a country that has such a terrible economic conditions. I ask you to review. I invite you to review these articles. The first one is Newsfront. Then in last August they had the following article. So, United States military presence in Africa, according to the author that lives in New York, troops from the United States develop 3,500 military actions in Africa per year. There's an average 10 per day. There's a United States commando in Africa that we mentioned, AFRICOM, that carries out operations with drones and intelligence, and says that they want to be responsible for health, security, development, and other areas. This year, the amount of militaries that went from 6,000 to 7,500, and in Somalia there was a doubling of troops. But the bases at up to 50, and last August the Division General assumed the command in Africa, saying we will begin to work in which way. This declassified secret files. According to the information for this content, they talk about evaluating and helping as euphemisms for invasion, war, and combat. I will go now to the next article. To the next information, this is the United States. Faces challenges in elections in Democratic Congo. But the chief of mission said that on each elections for 28 December, where the president will be elected, the activity of armed groups is worrisome, and lack of trust from the opposition in the elections, and the reduction of women candidates. There's also from that part of that worrisome panorama, we have the Ebola outbreak and the difficulties to contain it. This is what is called in articles. So even though we do see advances regarding to the elections, we need more measures for protection from and agreements between government and opposition, so we can guarantee safe elections. And now we'll go to our recommendation. It's in a blog spot called The Secret Wars of Pentagon in Africa More. And we can see, based on documents from the military documents from the United States that the portal has had access to, there's the report that about 100 missions being developed in Africa by the United States. What is presented as a presence is really an expansive movement from the military of the United States. And we have some numbers. In 2006, only 1% of all the military special forces from the United States deployed in foreign parts. In 2010, it went up to 3%. In 2016, it had gone over 17%. We're talking about an augmentation of 10% in a decade. So the general of the military that was saying the challenges that we have in Africa could create a greater threat that the one that United States faces at the moment coming from Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. And this is something that we might see of the developments for the next 30 years. This is our recommendation, and we add, when inequality becomes an everyday thing, what do we have? What has to happen so that these nations in very regional resources and to stop being reduced to mere providers of resources and cheap labor to the rest of the world. We talk now with Oscar Rebelde, who has been invited by several nations in Africa, and Oscar Rebelde. Good evening. The injustices and inequalities of the capitalist colonialism is like a charge that is impossible to bear in the Congolese land. Subjected to a status quo that is with many manipulative ideologies that acts as commissions of great political and economical powers in the world. The governance. They play the role of fighting against capitalism, but knowing that they stay in the power it's because of their capacity and efficiency to be available make available rubber, uranium, copper, and cobalt, which has now become so strategic because of the electric locomotions. 2/3 of all the world reserves of cobalt can be found in the Congo. You are talking right now. We're talking about how we can stop being just merely a mine of the world. Maybe it's too small to answer. I'm too small to answer, but my naive answer would be, is maybe through a responsible democracy able to prevent corruption of the powers. However, we talk about in Congo Republic, we're going to an elections where there are many ghosts without any prints. Elections where machines will be employed, and which will transmit the results made in Korea, which could be manipulated if no precautions are made. And how do we make these precautions in this very tense scenario? Voting machines where they annul the secrecy of the vote, and on elections that have been that have been now at the moment that they hope that the elections fail, so that they go through to a transition where the rich people could preserve their powers and their fortunes, and all the massacres and the scandalous explanations of what is behind of these massacres. These bring to the Congolese people to the path of self-defense, especially especially in the east of the country, where the multinationals already have enough experience to gain the profit of a political stability of a authoritative regime, and also fragmentation and the chaos of the area. It's a roulette where the bank always wins. There's hope, however, which is inherent to life. Hope is internal, and the majority of the Congolese people are looking for a new intelligence that has awoken to the conscience of the curse of the Congo, that is explained through political sciences. A new youth that have paid $500 to be candidate to national deputy, and is prepared to go from village to village to talk and to sow hope in a popular assembly which cannot be corrupted. People that defend the principles of Lumumba, and in spite of the dirty war that are being subject to those who capture the wealth and who maintain the wealth in their own hands. Thank you, Oscar. So Congo is a very punctual example of the African reality, but in this case, very singular. Then it goes to elections on 23 December under these conditions. We have to ask, what is the political lines and what is the exact line that the White House has designed in the African continent, even though we have variations among the institutions of this network? We will answer this after the break. We will continue with the critical moves. We're talking about Africa, a continent filled with paradox, inequality with richness and the rich and poverty. We see is a geography of resources. Now, Africa limits at the north with Mediterranean Sea, on the west with the Atlantic Ocean, and the east with the Red Sea, Indic Ocean, and Suez Channel. The surface is 30 million square kilometers and a population of 910 million inhabitants. It's organized in 54 countries, 17 dependency, and 5 unrecognized territories. 17th century, the European powers began dividing up the continent into colonies, with only Liberia and Ethiopia remaining independent. But at the moment, they have still a lot of conflicts. Africa has 5 of the main producers of oil in the world: Nigeria, Angola, Libya, Algeria, and Republic of Congo, Cameroon, Chad, Egypt, Eritrea, Gabon, and Ghana, and Kenya, Sudan, South Sudan and Sudan are also rich in hydrocarbons. Also, Angola and Botswana are rich in diamonds. Benin, Burkina Faso, Tanzania also have gold in their soil. Burundi has nickel and uranium. Liberia has timber, Poznan cement, Cabo Verde. Mauritania, iron, and Uganda, Zambia, copper. Several African countries are in wars and has interference, international interference. One of these cases is the African Republic, which has uranium, diamonds, timber, hydrocarbon, and land. However, it's still among the 10 poorest countries in the world and the lowest people development in the world. It has the biggest amount of copper and cobalt in the world. However, most of the countries in Africa are still in means of development. Their economy do not answer cannot answer the needs of the population, and they have to exploit and export, which has left behind deforestation, destruction of ecosystems, exploitation and pollution of the hydrid resources. In this portal, we can find the world order, where we can find news and analysis. We see this article saying Frank Africa, or the neo-colonial French Empire. France left Africa in the decades of the 50s and the 60s last century. They had to leave, and they had to accept independence of the colonies that do not want to follow the guidelines of Paris. However, instead of evaporating their continental, France did manage to save a political structure, an economical and cultural structure that still maintains. France has come forth as a guardian of their old colonies, and Paris protects these interests, and at the same time tries to rescue their lost identity, and has their own backyard where they have to consider very few of the countries can say at the moment. This is what we base the idea of the Frank Africa, very well explained in this article called Frank Africa, or the neo-colonial French Empire, the second water reserve that produces 20% of the oil gold of the world. However, those lands are very unstable and we will go now to deepen our knowledge. One of the most punished countries because of violence is the Central African Republic. According to the UN, says 1,200,000 people that represent 1 out of 4 people left the country since the war was in 2013. They have left to Chad, and the Central Africans that require humanitarian aid to child mortality 18 going up to 80%, and most children is not fed well. And this republic, in the Republic of Congo, is in a war with Congo, and it has generated 2.2 million refugees, according to international organisms. In this country, we see at least 17 groups, armed groups, and many multinationalities and governments that fund these groups, and they exploit the land. Like five people every day leave their home. Of course, we're talking about the political crisis, which have seen protests a lot at the beginning of this year against the President Joseph Kabila, that left 8 people dead, and his mandate ended in 2016, but he's still in charge. He won't be until next 23rd November, where they have elections, where they will design his next successor. And also now an outbreak of Ebola and also impact this country. Another country that has been punished by violence, South Sudan, after cruel confrontations. We see in Eritrea and Ethiopia, they signed the peace treaty between the president and the main leader of the opposition. South Sudan have a very strategic importance, among other things, because it's calculated that beneath the soil there's at least 400 million barrels of oil. Very little has changed the relations between the players of the past and those today. We see this network of absolutely of independence and complete interference, and we want to analyze this from Mexico, and we will talk with Mexico, with the ex-secretary of the ex-secretary for the international relations with Africa. We are talking about. I will read this quote from regarding the military actions. We're talking about postmodern variations of the carrot. The Leviathan of North America is also that uses military force and violence, and the civil administrators that try to manage or that manage on the territory itself. All the aspects that have to do in all the spheres of the social spheres in that territory. I ask you, is this as that we see in Africa, or can we add something more? Maybe something about the policy that is being developed by the United States in this continent. What is your opinion? Good evening, Lucia, and thank you for your question. I think there are several elements. Yes, we are talking about a policy that has been gestating for more than a century, not only from France as the main axis for this expansionist policy in the continent in the 19th century, but it's also important to remember that the United States, since the 19th century, has had a presence initially discreet that through the decades has become worse. And you were mentioning previously, you were talking about the Berlin Conference, where the European nations broke up the African continent. Also, but there's one thing that we need to remember, is that the United States, even though they were not part of this part of Africa, but it was an observer, because evidently at the time the United States did not have any presence in the continent, and it was always waiting. And with the colonization, what we have as a result in the 50s, in the last century, a decolonization that is proposed by the United Nations and the United States. Why? Because the United States wanted to increase their presence in the continent that was going that they knew already they had a lot of natural resources that were not detected yet, and some that were found through time. I believe that the main element for that policy or that vision, particularly, are the resources, the plundering of the natural resources, where these two policies they carried out. But also we must remember the presence of China in the continent, where the only thing that matters to them is to acquire what they don't have. So from the military point of view, the geopolitical position of the continent, it's very important, so that through any means they can achieve their goals. If we see in the timeline and the sequence of the facts, we find this thing that shows up. Countries that are in war because they're poorly organized, or maybe it's because the war is a business that has broken up their order and that keeps them in the situation where they apply instability, political and economical instability. How do you see it? Yes, Cesar has already written a lot about how the war is how war is an instrument to keep the countries. In this case, we see the African countries as the best example, and to keep them unstable, because if they are unstable, which with whose consequences are wars or maybe the migration of many people we see that we find that the natural sources are left alone. So a, this is not a problem that generates spontaneously, but the potency, the world potencies have been structuring in better ways through the years. In just as you were explaining before. For example, the presence of France in the continent, I believe that there's a detail that is very important to mention. The main territories that were francophone, casually they had an agreed independence, and this independence was agreed with France. France got rid of the control of these territories, but they made through an agreement. In very few cases, there was a war for independence. Let us remember one of such examples was the war in Algeria, because it took many years for France to free their Algerian territory. However, casually, in those territories that we see are countries wherein the independences were agreed, they are the ones that have most political and social instability have at the moment, because simply when it was an agreed independence, they still had a friendly link with with their colony, and this has generated a codependency that right now we see those francophone countries, they look towards France as their father. If you take this as a metaphor, France is the chief of all Africa, because they know they can resolve whichever which way they want all the problems that may rise up in the continent. It's well known that they're well known as the gendarme of Africa. So it's a construction of the West where the main objective is to use the resources, and where we use the resources, if we need to create a war, we do it. If we need to generate political uncertainties in the countries, they do it too. And also, what we are saying, we're talking about a neo-colonialism. And France, in their paternalist role, even though is still something very anachronistic at this moment in time. So yes, simply, I insist, there's a codependency from the countries themselves, because paradoxically, the countries themselves are the ones that request aid. Let us remember several cases, Niger's, Mauritania's, where governments do not have the resources to fight against terrorism or to fight against a coup. Immediately they turn to to ask for the help for the president in turn, for the president of France, whichever he may be. So if we're talking about intervention mechanisms and silent wars, and what are those mechanisms? Who carry them out? What happens with the United Nations and organizations with NATO, such as NATO? Those are different ways of behaving. The United Nations, for example, in Africa, we see those are the missions that are present, particularly with specific objectives, depending on the country, the region, or the problematic. However, we also see other mechanisms, for example, those that carry out by NATO, where we see a more evident interference, so they can use the natural resources. For example, I know, even though it happened many years ago, in 2011, the intervention of NATO in Libya to take down Gaddafi, and at the same time, and theoretically to liberate a dictator of 30 years. So here we see interference is that the first thing that they took over is the oil fields. And the civil population did not matter. What mattered was to control the natural resource. And this is what we see other examples in the continent. I believe that this intervention that we're talking about is always with the finality of using the resources. Africa is always seen as the niche where they can find resources and very cheap labor and exploited labor. But this creates many other problems where we can see Ebola outbreaks, for example, and many other problems of instability, political instability. And right now, transnationals, they also divide a very juicy market, and they remain with most of the profits. Yes, because the multinationals, what they do, what happens in Africa, for example, we're talking about pharmaceuticals, and we can see in many situations where it has transcended. What happens in Africa, there are testing of pills and medicaments that are later sold in the West. But Africa is the laboratory where they test it out. And the transnationals from other types, for example, oil businesses, those that buy and sell phosphates, what we were talking about, that was listening very clearly the case of Morocco regarding phosphates, where what happens there is that we need to consider that we're talking a plundering of these natural resources by Morocco. These resources are then sold to big transnational companies of phosphates and minerals in the world. Here we have some data that we found in our investigation. For example, even though it's traded, only 10% of the benefits of the natural resources extraction remains in the continent. Only 10%. These benefits can be seen, especially in the financing of the guerrillas that control diamond and gold mines, and they have to pay these permits to the guerrillas, and they still keep buying armaments and weapons to keep killing all those people. So this is a very raw reality, and what we're talking about transnationals. So yes, it's a combination between the only thing that matters to achieve our goal. And so if the government sometimes do not pay attention to fight against rebel groups because we're talking it's getting to a problem that grows bigger and bigger. So what they decide to do is they do not see it, they turn a blind eye. So these interests can carry out these legal transactions because evidently these are concessions that are sold illegally. A rebel group cannot sell a concession for any type of mineral. This can only be done through the government. But sometimes the government, they turn a blind eye, and they do not watch out or look out of that this business is carried out legally. Thank you for your time. I am very grateful for the opportunity to talk about the reality, the African reality, that many times we do not have access only through your programs. So, Ms. Flores from Mexico. So, and Pan-African and Congolese, they had the preventions, the multinationals in their countries in the context of the summit of the African Summit, number 30th. The Commissary of Trade and Business, Africa loses almost $900 billion in illegal trades, and most of them are coming from the illegal extractions and the mineral extractions, and those laws is come through several very creative accounting carried out through the multinationals. We'll go now to a break, and after we have finished this analysis, and now we have to ask ourselves: can Africa step away from this condition of being the provider of the mine and the geography of cheap labor. And where is the solution? In these multinational organisms, in the South-South cooperation? How is this coming up in a world that is coming, a multipolar world where they're all related as they will work together as equals? And we will go now to our break. A very specific case. The United Nations has presence in Congo, and the missions of the United Nations in the Congo. What is the remains of that presence? What is the total of that presence? The intervention of the UN through the MONUSC was decreed in March 2013, and it was a first-time action. And this Council of Security to participated militarily against military insurgent military groups. In Congo right now, we're talking about international police in that country and blue helmets, according to the data from the United Nations. And what has remained from this? What generates this in the Congolese population? In 2016, seven denounces of sexual abuses in this year, with denounces of abused children by the blue helmets. Over in 2017, more than 1 million had already migrated. In a documentary that was passed in Russia today, I cannot say that Congolese we master our own destiny because we are not the ones that benefit from all the mineral richness that we have, but the rest of the world become rich while we become poor and poor. Last December, the blue helmets had a very harsh attack where 15 were killed and 53 were wounded. This happened in the eastern province, where they have the Front Alliance, Democratic Front Alliance, which is one of the biggest parties that have the most power, guerrilla groups that have most powers, and they have and these are one of the main groups that operate in this country. And also we can see we have seen more than 10 cases of denunciations of sexual claims, and we were talking about of all the claims that were seen for all against all their subordinates. In the UNICEF take the children are the worst victims, are the victims, more and from children from Burundi, Uganda, and the Congo Republic. They become part of the wars. They provide sexual employment, and also they transmit messages. And also, we will talk about the specialist. Thank you very much for being with us. And these organizations, international organisms, have not been able to pull this off. And how do they take advantage of the situation? Do they create it? Do they reinforce it? Are they convenient? What is happening? You have to understand, first of all, that this is a situation, multifactorial situation. We have to begin the Berlin Conference in 84, 85, 1884, 85, where they divide the Africa for the European countries, 1884. Among these, we have to consider the Congo, one of the that has suffered the most. These that has seen their land ravaged, and their people ravaged. Now we have to consider what has been happening with the United States and their presence in all this area. In 2007, they create a structure that they call African with the excuse to control the terrorist groups and all these other groups that have created instability in the area. However, the reality is that this African organization comes hand in hand with the transnationals that are interested in all the natural resources for example, in Congo, one of the richest countries in the world, but also the poorest one, and also impoverished one. So this presence of the United States is very similar, and we must remember of the work that they carried out in South America, Condor Plan, with the pretext of helping and organizing, but it's a penetration. It's the same modus operandi, and it's a violation of the sovereignty through a line that is to take over the natural resources. Africa is the same. Suffering is the hunger, famine, misery, all these things that are happening. If they were helping, we would see improvements, but what we see every day is the deepening of these conflicts, the attitude of plundering and stimulation of all the religious institutions and internal combats, while the transnationals extract the natural resources from this country. So what about the media? And when we're talking about this, do they magnify the situation? So the media is also part of the imperial structure, and they will not show the world the reality. A case that is very close to us, it's Venezuela. We can see Venezuela and all the circumstances and all the situations that we've had to conquer, and the reasons why are not presented, but also try to oppress and control. Not showing reality. In Africa, they will never do it. We have been working, we have been analyzing, and we know, trying to do this more closely, but let the world see the reality of Africa as something that is far away. Outbreak of Ebola, poverty, ignorance, we don't take them into account. But who has generated this? And I talked to you previously about the Berlin conference. They sat down on a table, so that colonial. So imperialism comes at that time, and they thought that they could take over that territory, and they could and break pieces and parts, just like as you give parts and pieces of a cake. So the product of all of that is poverty created by them, because the Africans did not call them to give over their land, and they divide people and give them different languages, create conflicts. And so the conflicts today have deep roots from, for me, it's born with that conference, because they violently broke the natural structure and essential structures that they had in the continent, and they imposed their own religion, their rules, and they enslaved those people, these noble people, all through the need of taking over their land and riches. So the solution would be in cooperation, in South-South cooperation, and the way how to relate between the relation that took between Venezuela and all the other nations in Africa, where 20 years ago we would not even think about that Venezuela would have a diplomatic seat there. So yes, effectively, the relations between the people, between the Africans, South Americans, would be a window through complementation, cooperation, to help each other, because only we know our own problems without interference, respecting our thought processes, respecting our cultures and values. We must have dialogues and cooperation. We must help to educate each other, because this potency, these countries, they did not allow the intellectual development of the African people, because if that would have happened, they would not have had the possibility of control that that is still is applied today. So there's a latent war in the continent, product of the interests that are played out because the Western countries still want to have a part in it. So yes, the war is there. I'm talking about a big scale, beyond the specificities. So no, I cannot say that because the interests, what has happened in our internal wars, or trying to undermine the strength of the governments so they can be controlled. They separate and they finance those separations and create an instability, and afterwards they have their own tranquility. So they do have they create differences through religion, the separation, and they motivate and this separation. So we can see it here in Libya. Libya was one of the most prosperous nations in Africa. It was destroyed, killed Gaddafi, and we see now Libya, which is a mess. But the area where the oil industry is, it's an Eden. It's an oasis. Nothing happens there. It's under in the hands of the invaders, and while the rest of the people, the Libyan people, are facing group by group against each other, that they find each other, and there's a chaos in the area. In the same way, we're talking about Congo. After this war that took place, which was very cruel in Congo, all the groups, in the eastern part of Congo, they break into several religions and several interests of other countries where they have given rise to more instability in the region. Also because so they would never have allowed the left, so project from the left, because here everybody is going to work. We will educate everybody, and we will fight to have our people move forward, and will respect our sovereignty, our own resources. Resources remain with us. So we talk about Venezuela and Chavez, for example, that made evident and told the world and Venezuelans about our strength. They knew it, but when they realized that the Venezuelans already have conscience of their own strength and the strength of their own country, they have now we see the permanent attack to break the revolution, because what happens is that they don't want that the people empower themselves and handle their own resources. They want to have a fast track to take these resources without any problems or conflicts, so that conflicts be for the people and for the nations, but not at the level so they can carry out their own projects. So here we can see an opportunity, for example, that in Europe that has a very old population. Africa has more than 100 million young people. So here we see, is there a possibility there, an opportunity to change things? I believe that Africa, at this moment, there's a group of countries that are on the first list of development. Maybe we don't see them because we're not informed, but gradually the young people are becoming aware of the historical situation and what has happened with their countries. So yes, I do believe so, but Africa also needs cooperation from other countries like Venezuela, where they have a conscience of defending their own resources and respecting their sovereignty, even though we can work hand in hand with the African countries. The national government, fortunately, is understanding the importance of the relation with Africa. We're talking about 55 countries. Those are our brothers and sisters. So yes, included so. because we're so it's 54 countries, but Sahrawi, but Venezuela does recognize Sahrawi. So it's an African country. So what we see here, we do not exclude anybody. Everybody is part of this big continent. They are our brothers and sisters. We're solidarity with them. We show solidarity, and now we have to work for them. We have to come towards them, and we must understand in this way. We see the presence of countries such as Russia, China, where they have a different vision. Right now, they have just used. There's a meeting between China and the African countries where and looking for other ways, looking for ways to strengthen each other and to help development, because there's an awareness that maybe through the cooperation and relations between the South countries, and all we see, and all these countries that they have been participating, like Russia and China will help Africa to Africa to leave this situation, this terrible situation that was shown by the potencies in Europe. Thank you for being with us. We will reach now our conclusions. Plundering and deprivation are not things from the past. Wars that have left open wounds, and participation of colonial European potencies that have interfered from the United States and have acted violently against these structures. What are the conflicts from the countries in Africa? How have this is a heritage from the colonialism, and right now imperialism and with the expansionism. How are so many troops of the United States can be found in this continent? France and the United States cannot go back home because they see Africa as their niche of natural resources that they want, and cheap labor. And others such as Venezuela on this side of the world, we talk about cooperation, South-South cooperation, and we talk about multipolar world. So far, our critical moves. Thank you for being with us today. Until next time.